Happy Mother's Day. Mothers, you are champions. I wished my mom happy Mother's Day this morning. And the reason we take a moment to really celebrate moms and dads, although who are we kidding? Father's Day is a joke compared to Mother's Day. Nobody cares about Father's Day. What's the deal? But each individual person and each role that God gives reflects God's character in a special way. And for me, when I was thinking about the way in which my mother reflects the character of God, a very specific thing came to mind, that the scriptures tell us that it's godly to speak the truth in love. And my mother has the ability to just deliver this freight train of truth like a steamroller over me, and it flattens me, but she does it with this most gracious smile, to where afterwards I feel flattened, bruised, wrecked, and loved all at the same time. She has this amazing ability. But happy Mother's Day, Mom. When you watch this on video on the podcast, love you so much. Now, it's ironic that today is Mother's Day because our topic of conversation has to do with our families of origin. In the book that has the same premise for the series we're doing, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Peter Scazzero gives symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality, and one of them that he lists is ignoring or rejecting the impact of the past on our present. So not paying attention to or dealing with the amount of influence that our family of origin and that our past has on our present. And the truth is that it has a significant effect, but we'll often fall into two different categories. Some of us believe, I can mind over matter it, and I can cut ties, I can cut it off, I don't really have to deal with it, I can run away from it and be my own person. I decide how much influence my family of origin has in my life. The other side is feeling completely imprisoned or victimized by it. And the truth is that we all have to pay attention to it and deal with it in our hearts, and we need to let God help us because we all need serious help. This is emotional, it's sensitive, and it's very, very vulnerable for us. So we want to figure out how to be emotionally healthy and spiritually healthy when it comes to dealing with the past and its impact on the present. So what we're going to do this morning, in order to help us do that, we're going to look at the story of Joseph in the Bible. Now, typically what we've been doing in this series is looking at stories from the life of Jesus. So I'm breaking the rules a little bit, but I help make them, so I figure I can break them a little bit. It's a terrible, parenting approach. I made the rules, I can break them. So this is far less stakes. But the life of Joseph, I think, illustrates this point perfectly. That Joseph's life his family of origin was messed up. His father had two wives, which creates enough problems in and of itself, but he favorited his children from the one wife over the children from the other wife. And this caused an incredible amount of divisiveness in the family, so much so to where Joseph's brothers hated him. Now, Joseph was pretty arrogant, and his brothers got ticked off, but what they did to deal with it was, this is severe. They faked his death at the hands of a wild animal, and they sold Joseph into slavery, going down to the land of Egypt. But Joseph's story has a definite bow wrapped on it, because it's a true rags to riches story. He goes into Egypt, and he starts serving as a bondservant in the house of Potiphar, who is a high official in the Egyptian court. And he gets entrusted with all of Potiphar's house and wealth because he's an amazing steward. He just does a good job. He doesn't whine, he doesn't gripe, though he has really good reason to. And he just serves Potiphar to where he rises up and Potiphar says, "Here, you're in charge of everything." And everything seems to be going well, but then the Jaws music gets introduced. And Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with Joseph. She finds him attractive, and she's like, "I want you." And he says, "No way. I fear God. I'm not going to sleep with you." And after all, Potiphar, your husband, has given me charge over his entire house. How could I betray him like that? So what she does is she goes and falsely accuses him. Now Potiphar, it's unclear whether or not he believed her, but in order to save face, he goes and throws Joseph into prison, into the dungeon. And here we have Joseph who, for all intents and purposes, is really innocent in his entire story. And he is in a prison, in the dungeon, in Potiphar's prison. But overnight, after a number of years, God takes him and brings him in front of Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the land, and gives him this miraculous ability to interpret a dream from Pharaoh. And in the same day, he goes from a prisoner in a dungeon to second in command over all of Egypt. It's pretty amazing. Now, often we'll think that that's where Joseph's story ends, but it isn't. That is not the paramount scene in the story of Joseph's life. So we're going to look at what is, and it's his encounter with his brothers. When Joseph has come to this point where he's second in command over all the land, there's a famine in that region, but God had basically told him there's going to be a famine. So he began to store up grain. And when there's a famine in the land, all of the surrounding nations start coming to Egypt to get grain. And one group of those people is his family from the land of Canaan. And when his brothers show up, obviously, it gets emotionally charged. And this man, who is the second most powerful man in the world at the time, realizes that though I've been released from the prison, from Potiphar's dungeon, I'm still in a different kind of prison. I'm in an emotional prison of unforgiveness and hurt and anger and shame. And he goes back and forth. He's trying to be gracious, so at times he's being kind, but then he gets really angry and he throws them into prison at one point. But then he brings them out and he gives them grain and sends them back. It's an unbelievable scene to read about his emotional turmoil when it comes to encountering his family of origin. Now, what we're going to look at is his final encounter. And this is where everything comes to a head. And what we're going to see is that Joseph is going to help us. He's going to help us understand what it looks like for us to deal with the impact of our past on our present. So we're going to be in the book of Genesis, chapter 45, and we're going to read verses 1 through 15. Genesis 45, verse 1 through 15. The scriptures are going to be up on the screen. Feel free to follow along in a Bible or on a Bible app on your phone. I'm reading out of the English Standard Version. Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15 says this. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you. For there are yet 5 years of famine to come. So that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here.' Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept on his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. After that, his brothers talked with him. Will you pray with me? God, we need your help this morning. This is very difficult for many of us. This is emotionally charged and sensitive territory. But God, we don't want to be stuck in prisons from our past. We truly want to come to a place of freedom so that we can pursue the purpose that you have for each of our lives. But God, we can't free ourselves from them. We need your help. Would you help us by your Holy Spirit this morning? In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So this is Joseph's final encounter with his brothers. And you notice that no amount of status can free him from the prison of his past. Here he is, the second most important person in the entire world. And he encounters his brothers, and he breaks down. Emotion overcomes him. He's crying. He's weeping so loud that everybody around, even outside the doors, can hear him. And the truth is that we will oftentimes try to cover over the prisons from our past with other things. We'll pursue a job. We'll really pour ourselves into a career and cut ties and pour all of our time and energy and our hours. We're literally working 80 hours a week. But the truth is that there are going to be those moments where our past comes back, flooding into our present. When work is over and you don't have all the distractions and you lie down on your pillow at night, a memory comes to mind, or an experience, a picture, a thought. And all of that emotion comes welling up into the present. We truly cannot escape the prisons from our past by covering over it. Joseph tells us that. But here's what Joseph's life is going to illustrate, which is true for him as well as it is true for us, is that the prisons from our past either prevent us from God's purpose or prepare us for it. The prisons from our past either prevent us from God's purpose or either prevent us from God's purpose or prepare us for it. So how do the prisons from our past prevent us? Well, like I said, there are these moments where the past comes rushing into the present, and the truth is that it cripples us. It really does impact us. Try as we might to be composed and to not let it impact us. It will impact us, and the way it typically impacts us is in our relationships. If you've ever been married, oh my goodness, from that first day, the past comes rushing into the present, and you discover everything you thought you left behind comes and affects your relationships in the present. It's true in friendships. Ways in which your family of origin influence you will influence the relationships you have in the present. Affirmation that you may or may not have gotten growing up. The way it influences your security in the present. Fear of intimacy that you may have seen displayed in your parents, where there wasn't a lot of affection and a lot of verbal affirmation of, I love you and I care for you and you're precious to me. That impacts the way that we are going to express our care and our love for others. Maybe there were patterns of anger and abuse from the past that absolutely influence our present. And if we don't deal with those, we are going to be hindered in our relationships. And relationships that's the bread and butter of life, isn't it? I mean, you go to work, people are there. You go to your family, people are there. Friendships, people are there. People are a staple of life, whether you like it or not. Go find a little island in the Narragansett Bay and stick out there, but see how long you last without food from the grocery store. People who supply the grocery store with food. We have to figure out how we're going to deal with it. So how do these prisons from our past prevent us from God's purpose? Well, in Joseph's story, little does he know, but this is a pivotal moment in the story of what God is doing with the entire world. Here's what I mean. Joseph is one of 12 brothers. Their father's name is Jacob, and Jacob's name would be changed to Israel. And these brothers would form what would eventually be the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, God had chosen the family of Israel to bring about his purposes for the entire world. And if we zoom way, 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 way out, that God created the world, and it was good, it was beautiful, it was thriving, but sin has broken it. It's basically vandalized it. But God cared so much about the world and about people in it that he began a restoration process, a story of rescue, and he began with this man whose name was Abraham, Joseph's great-great-grandfather. And God was going to use the nation of Israel, that began as the family of Jacob, to bring salvation to the entire world. But Joseph is faced with a choice. He's the second most powerful man in Egypt and therefore the world. And here are the very people who sold him into slavery. The very people who have put him in a prison of anger and of shame and of regret and of all the pain from his past. Here they are right in front of him. And he, with the click of his fingers, could kill them. With no recourse from anybody. At the very least, he could send them back to Canaan empty-handed and let them starve to death, and it would just be out there and you wouldn't have to deal with it. But he could have ended their lives right there and then. We wouldn't be reading about his life, though. God would have chosen another family in another way. But here you have Joseph, unaware that he is at a pivotal juncture, not just in his own life, but in the entire course of history. And what God is doing in the entire world, what he is going to do in this moment can make or break his role in God's big purposes. The truth is that that's how it works in our lives too. We just see it as one little decision, one little circumstance. Do I forgive or don't I forgive? Do I distance myself or do I reconcile? We just see one decision, but you and I don't know what's at stake. We don't know what hangs in the balance if you fast forward 20 years in the way that God might want to use that for you to really embrace the purpose that he has in your life, and more importantly, your role to play in his big story of rescue and salvation. How we deal with those relationships are pivotal. And they do have the very real ability to prevent us from God's purpose or prepare us for it. In Joseph's case, we're reading about his life because he played this role in God's story of salvation for the entire world. Imagine what God could do through your life. Imagine the role that God has for you to play in his grand story of rescue. How can we be a part of that rather than excluding ourselves from it through not dealing with these things in the right way? So how should we? How should we go about handling this very real, very painful, very sensitive, very difficult topic of dealing with these prisons from our past? And they are some very, very real prisons, aren't they? Well, let's look at what Joseph did. There are three very, very practical things that we can take from his life. And the first one is that we need to walk with God through these things. A staple of Joseph's life is that regardless of where he is, whether he was in the pit that his brothers threw him in when they were waiting for some slave traders to pass by, whether he was there or whether he was in Potiphar's house or in Potiphar's dungeon, or whether he was serving as the second in command over all of Egypt, he walked with God. He had a relationship with God. He prayed. He let God speak to the realities of his life. And the same is true with us. If we are going to be able to walk through this difficult experience of dealing with the past, we have to do it with God. And it's so tempting to distance ourselves from God because we'll often blame God, right? God, if you are God, you are the one, like, Why didn't you save me from that prison? Why didn't you prevent that abuse? Why didn't you give me parents who gave more affirmation? Why didn't you make my life easier? Why didn't you give me a past that would have led to more security so I didn't have to deal with this insecurity in the present? And we'll often, sometimes unconsciously, distance ourselves from God because in our hearts we truly blame Him. But we need to resist that. We need to draw close to God. We need to trust Him through it. We need to ask Him for help. We need to ask Him for guidance. So that's the first thing. We need to walk with God. And only when we walk with God can we do this second thing. And only when we do this second thing can we walk with God. And here's the second thing, is that we need to replace self-pity with providence. We need to replace self-pity with providence. Never once does Joseph grumble about his past. Never once does he point back and say, oh, this is all because of what happened back there. No, he pours into what God has put right there and then. He serves diligently in Potiphar's house. He even reacts righteously when he's falsely accused of rape by Potiphar's wife. When he's in the dungeon, he's not grumbling before God. Yes, he probably has some very real prayers, but he's not pointing back and saying, because of the prisons from my past, I can't do what you've called me to do. He doesn't dive into self-pity. And self-pity is interesting because this works in the small ways in our lives. Not just in the big ways, not just in the huge hurts that are so real and at the front of our minds. Self-pity works in the small ways. It works in those ways where we say, okay, because of what I've come from, it disqualifies me from what I could be. You know, if I had grown up in this family and had a better education, then I would have been able to work this job, and then I would have had a better life. But I didn't. If I had had these kind of parents, I would have been more emotionally in tune, and then I would have had better relationships. And so we analyze our lives through this lens of self-pity. And we mustn't do that. We mustn't do that. But, saying, don't do that is useless unless you're going to replace it with something else. And we have to replace self-pity with providence. And I love this word. Not only because it's the name of our wonderful city, but because of what it stands for and what it means. So have a look over here. Verse 7 and 8. Joseph says, "And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." Do we have a concept big enough to where God can preside over even the most difficult circumstances and experiences in our lives? Because this is kind of the crux of this message. This is the very thing that enables Joseph to move past hurts, to unlock the doors of the prisons that he's been in his entire life. Prisons that have lasted decades are unlocked by this belief that God is provident and oversees all of it. All of it. If you and I are going to get free of the prisons that hold us in chains and that keep us in and that wreck our relationships, that put strain on our marriages and our jobs and our friendships and cause us to move from one thing to the next without healing and without wholeness. If we're going to free ourselves from those prisons, we have to lay hold of this biblical truth that God is sovereign over all of it. And not only is He sovereign over all of it, but He can use that very thing to bring us into the purpose He has for our lives. Get this. These pains and these hurts, these prisons aren't just something that we need to work past, that we just need to get through and move on with. These prisons are the very things that brought Joseph into his destiny, into his purpose, and into his part to play in God's greater purpose. That is true of the things that you deal with in your life. These aren't just shackles that hinder you, prisons that keep you, and then one day when I'm free of them, I move on. These can be the very things that God uses to bring you into the fullness of the purpose that He has in your life. Do you believe that? Honestly, I think we have a very real enemy who wants to keep us from this reality. That God is at work even in our pain, even in the prisons from our past, that He can and does use those to bring us into the fullness of the calling and the purpose He has in our lives. So that's the second thing. Replace self-pity with providence. But thirdly, and most difficultly, forgive. We have to forgive. That's how the passage ends. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and after that his brothers talked with him. All of these things, walking with God, replacing self-pity with providence, brought Joseph to the point where he was able to forgive his brothers. And that is what opened the door to his purpose. Now, right when we talk about forgiveness, it's difficult. And let's clarify something. Forgiveness is not letting somebody off of the hook. It's not letting somebody off of the hook. Look here at verse 4. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." He brings up the very thing that they're ashamed about and embarrassed about. He is very real about it. He doesn't gloss over it. Well, it wasn't all that bad. Well, you could have done worse. No, he says, this is terrible. You sold me into slavery in Egypt, and I'm going to forgive you for it. I'm going to forgive you for it. And what he does is that in order to forgive, rather than take his own revenge on his brothers, which you and I don't usually get that opportunity. We're not usually in the position to where we can inflict maximum pain on those who have inflicted maximum pain upon us. But Joseph was. He was. He could have killed them, just like that. Now we do it in subtle ways, passive aggression, comments on Facebook, digs, like sideways compliments, right? Like, was that a compliment? I'm not sure. And we have all these subtle ways which our unforgiveness begins to leak out of us. But what we need to do is forgive. And here's how we can forgive. Is that forgiveness is not diluting the grievousness of the sin that people have committed against you. What it is that it is entrusting justice to God. Saying, I'm not going to take the revenge I believe I'm due, but I'm going to entrust that God is just and He will repay sin in His own way, on His own terms, in a way that is perfectly just and perfectly good. Because I can't. That's what it means to forgive. Now, as inspiring as Joseph's story is, in these deep places of hurt in our lives, an inspiring story only goes so far, doesn't it? Joseph's story is inspiring, but to somebody who abused me, doesn't inspire me to forgive. To somebody who inflicted such deep hurt that I've dealt with it every day for my entire life, this story is not going to empower us to forgive that. But here's what will. Is realizing the one to whom Joseph's life points. Joseph was a victim who did next to nothing wrong in his story. There was another victim who did absolutely nothing wrong. His name was Jesus Christ. He was the ultimate victim, having never made a wrong move in his life, having only ever acted out of love and mercy and care. He received absolute victimization. They threw Joseph in a prison alive. They put Jesus in a tomb, dead, after just having been crucified on a cross. But what we find out is that God did that to forgive us. God did that to forgive us. Yes, we are all victims, but we are also all victimizers. We have all sinned, and every single sin was an affliction against God. And rather than, like Joseph could have done, clicked fingers and annihilated us, Because all power was necessary in the hands of Jesus to do that. What he did instead was that he took the full weight of that revenge upon himself when he died on the cross. The only thing that will empower you to forgive those who have hurt you deepest is to realize that you have been forgiven, that you have been the recipient of oceans of grace in your life. Will you extend forgiveness to those who have hurt you by seeing the extraordinary grace and mercy that God the Father has poured out upon you? Will you do that this morning? When you find that difficult, look to Jesus Christ. Look to Jesus Christ, the greater Joseph, the one who has forgiven you and gives mercy and grace to you.